Hey everyone out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and this is my top 10 countdown. This is where I go through all the books I read in this past week and tell you my top 10 favorites. Of course, this is a subjective list. This is just my personal opinion, so maybe take it with a grain of salt. I will not go into any major spoilers about these books, so don't worry. However, if you don't want to hear anything about a book or something like that, check out below because I'll have chapters and timestamps there for you so you can skip if necessary. So it's a big week of books as usual, and I had a pretty solid week. I will say this up front because I know one of the biggest releases this week was Red Room #1 by Ed Piskor, and people may be wondering why that's not on my list. And it is on my list. It was on my list a few weeks ago when it was available digitally, at least for a brief moment in time. So if you don't see it on my list this week, it's not that I did not like it or I disliked it, but I just kind of, I guess, jumped the gun early a little bit with that one. So there you go. But enough of that. Let's get into the actual countdown, starting with my number 10. My number 10 this week is Snow Angels #4. This is published by Comixology, written by Jeff Lemire and art by Jacques. And this is the last issue in the first chapter of this book. This sees Mei Mei and Millie on the run trying to protect themselves from this evil snowman with their dad in tow, although he is still nursing a leg injury because he was bitten by a bear. And for those that don't know, this story takes place in a dystopian future. I know there's a lot of those, but it is another one of those. But it exists in this actually like ice world, basically. And what's different about it is how isolated the actual world is. It all takes place in this ice canyon that everyone has now been living in. And after the first issue where there was this mauling by this creature or person or robot, we're not really sure, called a snowman, Millie, Mei Mei, and their father have been on the run trying to find a way to get free. The issue is that there's really no place to run, and they're finding that out more and more because, again, they're limited on this one path. When they have attempted to go away, they ended up getting into an issue with a bear. So it is this tense situation where you basically have the Terminator following them that is killing them, trying to kill them, and really nowhere to turn. It's a very desolate situation. In this issue, there is also some relatively major revelations that I think will obviously majorly shape what moves forward. And it was a pretty emotional issue too. And of course, violent. It's also great just getting Jacques art again. You know, it's been a while since we saw him in a book like this. And I think one of the benefits of it being Comixology is that there have been no delays. Like these first 4 issues came out all on time, all within a monthly, even maybe quicker than that basis. And if you love his art, it's stylized. It has a lot of intensity to it. I think it really fits this type of mold, especially when you have a world that is so desolate. And when the violence does occur, and seeing the sharp reds and blacks played against the crisp white, I think helps enhance it for sure. So I did like this issue, and I'm enjoying this series. Comixology Unlimited, Comixology has actually been having a pretty steady year, one of the best years they've had thus far when it comes to the original series. My number 9 this week comes from the world of Oni Press, and it's Jonah and the Impossible Monsters #3. This is written by Chris Samney and Laura Samney, art by Chris Samney with colors by Matt Wilson. So you've been enjoying the Firepower series from Image. Of course, Chris Samney's been drawing that, and it's the same art team as that book, but in a very different style of book. This is your YA kids type of story where you have this, again, I wouldn't say it's a dystopian future. It's more like a fantasy world that's being overtaken by these monster creatures. And this issue, we see Jonah and her sister again are traversing the land, like trying to find their father. There's a lot of themes of this book in the sense of seeing individuals on a journey, and this is another journey book, another book that had some emotional beats too. This actually, I think, took some time to, I think, catch up and take its breath a bit, because you get this scene with Jonah and her sister after they're dealing with some monsters that, you know, they're underground, and you get some more world building within it. But I felt, unlike sometimes when you get world building that feels like heavy exposition that is just there more for the reader than the characters, I felt this actually had a good combination of both, because it felt natural and organic to the story that was being told. One of my favorite moments of the entire book was actually in the opening. It was a good example of how to use perspective and scale in an effective manner. We see these 2 monsters at first that are fighting these looks like giant bugs, and then as things quickly turn awry when we see a foot come and step on them, and we look up, and it looks like it's Jonah, and she looks like this giant figure that just is all over the page, and just by using really great perspective. I think that's something Chris Samney's really good at, is he knows where to place the camera to add emotion and add exciting elements like this. Placing the camera is a big part of good storytelling when it comes to comics, and he's great at that. And I think too, it's just a good way of informing us about the character of Jonah, knowing that yes, she might be a small package, but she packs a heavy punch. She is in a way a giant herself, although she may not have the stature of one. As we've seen, she certainly seems to have potentially type of superpowers. It's not sure, but it's also great just getting a kid's book in a monthly format like this. It doesn't happen often. Oni Press, they have some monthly books, but mostly their monthly books tend to be on the mature side. It's nice seeing kids books that are like this, that are done by creators that are well known outside of the YA market. It's also cool seeing a husband and wife team doing a book together. That's pretty cool as well. If there's one complaint about this issue is in the series so far, is that I still think it's still trying to figure out its pacing. Each issue tends to end rather abruptly. Like we start to see things going and then we get an abrupt ending. That's a nice cliffhanger, but story-wise, pacing-wise, it just seems like it comes out of nowhere in a way. Maybe this will read better in trade overall, but as a single issue, despite that little quibble, I did really enjoy this book and continue to enjoy it. And like I said, it may not be everyone's cup of tea because it is very much your kid book. It's a very quick read. There's not a lot of dialogue here, although this is probably an issue that had the most dialogue as we get more of an adult perspective of what the world is like. And I think it's really adding to the danger and what will be moving forward with the narrative. My number 8 is actually the Autumnal number 7. I actually thought this was going to be the last issue of the series based upon the way issue 6 ended, but we're getting one more issue. At least I would assume one more issue, because I don't know how much story you can yield out of this. But I will say the first thing I think about when I think about this specific issue, really the series, are the colors. And I'm a fan of autumn. I love the changing of the leaves. It's usually a warm, aesthetically pleasing season. Now with this book and how the yellows and oranges pop off this page, especially in the opening scenes in this, I'm just going to think of the intensity that exists. It was one of those books where it's just like everything was happening right away, and everything felt crowded and busy in a good way, in the sense of like the world is all caving in on itself. And we learned a lot of secrets, a lot of what was really going on. And I don't think necessarily there's anything super surprising. It felt like it went the direction you were expecting, but that didn't necessarily hinder the what I got out of the issue. And I do wonder like where this is going to go next. I was kind of concerned. Like I was waiting for the next shoe to drop in a way. Like I'm thinking, okay, here we're going, and we're just waiting for the craziness to subside in order for our protagonist to make a heist and get out of the situation. And that didn't exactly happen. And I think you kind of understood too. And what you've had at the central theme of this too has been the connection between mothers and daughters has been a big piece of this. And I think you kind of see that coming to head in the idea of family and coming togetherness and that relationship and the murkiness of it. And this, I think the key moment in here, what was all leading to, it happened right at the end of this very issue. And then you have a character that has to make a choice. She makes a choice, and maybe she changes her mind at the very end. I just love the general look of the book too, like how things look faded on the page. And it makes sense because you have this town that is built upon this ideology that is kind of crumbling in on itself. But we shall see how it actually ends up in the end. Not to disparage the book, but I did think of something like Wicker Man, where you have like this cult coming together at the end, except this wasn't insane and you had no one like Nicolas Cage screaming bees. Outside of that, I really did enjoy this. For my number 7, we're going from a kid's book to something that may seem like a kid's book, but very much is not, with Stray Dogs number 4. This is by Tony Flex and Trish Forstner, and they've done in the past books like My Little Pony and things of that nature, and I think they certainly got acclaim for those. This, though, it almost seems like they're letting loose with what is happening, especially in this issue. And this story's been about these dogs that have all resided with one another. And one dog tends to remember her master and believes their new master is, in fact, someone that killed her, that he might be this crazy serial killer that kills individuals. And part of his plan is then to take their dog, and now they're all residing together. The problem is with dogs, they have messed up memories, and they tend to, go to whoever feeds them, and they become a fan of them. It's interesting seeing like almost like canine Stockholm syndrome, and then seeing them try to remember what happened. And this issue answers pretty much any question you may have of who's good, who's bad, who's evil, and it's relatively twisted. Again, with this not being a kid's book, this issue definitely answers that question. And I love, though, that it never strives away from the animation style, in the sense of it never gets overtly gruesome or something like that, which I feel like could be, cliche or something almost nihilistic. This level of tact when they showcase violence, in the sense of they're not going to show you everything. They're going to leave some things up for interpretation. But when they do show you something, and it is against the wall or something of that nature, because of that tact, it has that greater of an impact. And the coloring here, the style, is all on point. And these characters, these dogs, are seeing a bit of a rift in them as well, because again, dogs are loyal in a way. This goes against who they are, but you see this conflict ensue, very much like a prison movie, but through dogs, like I mentioned, like a canine Stockholm syndrome. I think when it came out, it was compared to Silence of the Lambs means Lady and the Tramp. And kind of, there's no love story here. If anything, it's the opposite. If any love story, it's between the dogs and their past owners. But I've been really enjoying this book. It's been quite the gem. I don't want to say it's a surprise, because again, these are creators who have had a lot of acclaim, done a lot of quality stuff, but it's one of those books that I'm glad that people are paying attention to, and I think it's one that's going to just gain in popularity as more and more people get the chance to read it. For my number 6, we're going to a book that returned this week with Stillwater number 5. This is written by Chip Zdarsky with art by Mike Spicer. And when we left off in the last issue of Stillwater, there was this massive explosion at Town Hall, and now we're dealing with the repercussions. And what we're seeing with this issue is that this new arc is an entire new status quo in a way. Stillwater's about this town where no one dies. It started with the story of this individual who went back to his hometown and not really knowing what happened. And what he learned is that they're not a big fan of outsiders, and that he was originally from this town and was one of the few to escape and now has come back. And the overall characters of these towns has really expanded. It actually reminds me a lot of something like a GCRN book, for example, something like Scalped, where you start through one perspective, you start through certain characters, and then it takes a step back to take time with other characters to really fill out this world. And now we're seeing that with this issue. This was by far the most intense issue, arguably the best issue of the series thus far. A piece of this issue that really stood out to me was how, when we have a world in which everyone kind of comes back to life, that there's no death, that extreme violence in a way doesn't really impact any people. What they actually take offense to is when property is damaged. So it wasn't the fact that people were hurt in this explosion that people are upset, but the fact that it actually destroyed a part of their town. That's why they're mad. And I have a tendency to think that there's an element of commentary in that. I don't know for sure, but I definitely think, considering we've seen that debate a lot recently about property damage versus personal life and what it means, perhaps that was there on purpose, perhaps it wasn't. But I just thought, on the other side of it, it was just a good way to showcase what these people value in a way, and how being immortal, being able to not die, how it changes your perspective, how it changes what you value. And it was just a way to, I think, take a concept and expand upon it in a way that's interesting and beyond just the general idea of everything. So I was a little worried about this series, honestly. Like, I was starting to kind of lose interest a bit. I feel like it needed something to kind of propel it forward. It was lacking that. And the last 2 issues, I think, or what this series was waiting for, because now we have this major threat, and you really have no idea, like, how can they get out of this? You have this, these Marines basically that are taking over this town, and now what are the repercussions? What was the answer? Before, it was like this debate between, does the town let them know who they are? Do they reveal themselves from the public? But now that debate has intensified to an entirely new degree. So there's a good chance the second volume will be even better than the first volume. So if you're a person like me that was debating about kind of dropping this book or going elsewhere, maybe check out this issue, because I do think that this started this new arc in a really strong footing. For my number 5, we're going to the world of Marvel for Fantastic Four Life Story number 1. This is written by Mark Russell with art by Sean Izaakis. And this, of course, is a new installment to the Life Story series. Last year, we saw Spider-Man Life Story that saw Spider-Man start in the 60s and go to 70s, 80s. And with each installment, we see him age, kind of rewriting the origin of that character. That was written by Chip Zdarsky with art by Mark Bagley. And now we're getting a new installment of that with a new creative team, with a new team that they're focusing on, of course, this time, the Fantastic Four. And the one thing I think I really liked about this issue specifically was it took its time. Like that was something I was curious about, because you're covering basically a decade in time with four characters. Like how exactly do you make that work? You might want to, with Spider-Man, you have one character, you have one storyline really that you're focusing on. Here you have a lot to juggle, and to me this was just an exercise in patience, in the sense of really good pacing to help divvy out the story. We're trying to understand what exactly is happening. John F. Kennedy, who's in this book, reaches out to Reed Richards and tries to get him to help with their space program. In doing so, and then because of certain budget cuts and things like that, after being approved, Reed Richards, and with the help of Sue Storm and Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, they kind of come together. Maybe unexpectedly, they're not necessarily people that are best friends. Ben Grimm is this kind of tangential character that comes into the fray, but then it makes what happens even more tragic, because he kind of just took a chance. He doesn't have that relationship with Reed beforehand, which I think we've seen in different versions of the Fantastic Four, where they were college friends, and then we see this tragedy happen. But now that is not the case. Ben Grimm's first interaction with Reed is this mission, and of course goes horribly. So it stayed with the general origin pretty well, but then expanded beyond that, and you saw the Fantastic Four becoming the Fantastic Four, at least in the public eye. But personally, maybe things are not as strong. Again, Ben Grimm dealing with the repercussions of becoming this monster, his fiance no longer loving him the way that she did, because he looks like this man, this monster, to quote one of the best single issues of comics of all time. And it, of course, then did interject some real life political moments, but not to a great degree. Honestly, thought there would be more to that, but I think it does make sense, because you have a lot for this issue already, and I think the '60s comparisons have been done a lot. But you get things like Lyndon B. Johnson showing up, a single panel to help emphasize the John F. Kennedy assassination, which the iconic image of young John Kennedy kind of saluting his father, and that's all that was there. I think it was very economical in that, to utilize historical moments, their classic iconography or imagery, rather than kind of hammering home each and every bit. So kind of balancing both of those. That's what I think was most impressive about this, was how it was able to balance so much and give us all these characters and really meaningful moments, and then also the struggles with each. I would say really the two characters that probably shine the most are Ben and Reed. Johnny and Sue, I think, don't have as much at stake within this issue outside of that. So my hope is that with the upcoming issues that we'll get more into them and more into the dynamic between Reed and Sue. That's my guess, especially when we've seen them interact in the past life story issues. And with Spider-Man, I think they showed up there as well. But generally, though, considering everything that was done, I really enjoyed the tone of this. I really enjoyed the approach. If you did enjoy Spider-Man life story, I think you'll enjoy this. Even if you're not a huge Fantastic Four fan, I think you might enjoy it, because my Fantastic Four fandom is not gigantic. I've read some Fantastic Four. I enjoy them here and there, but it's not a team that I am over the moon about. But I just thought the approach here, the craftsmanship, is what really sold me. My number 4 this week comes from the world of Aftershock Comics with Undone by Blood, The Other Side of Eden, number 3. And this is a continuation of the Undone by Blood series that came out last year, but changing the overall characters in it, but continuing with a similar premise. The idea of this story is that you have one story that is the main focus, but then you have a character that is reading a book, and that's a Western book that relates to what that character is going through. This is written by Lonely Nadler and Zach Thompson, with art by Sammy Cavella, with colors by Jason Wordie, and letters by Hassan Osami Ileo. My apologies for any names I mispronounced there, but what you have with this issue is Silvano, after the heist of last issue, they're going on the run, and in that process, they have a car that is broken down and gets stuck, so they walk and walk and walk, eventually getting to a friend, a mutual friend, and they get help with him, and his young son is there as well, and they're kind of hanging out. But I don't want to give things away, but bad things happen as you would expect. And I think why I love this issue, 2 reasons. One, the colors here, I think, are really what drive this concept from working as well as they do. When you have so many shifting pieces, you have 2 different storylines going on at the same time, it can be easy to get convoluted. But I think the colors do a good job of really setting the stage, especially in this. You have kind of 2 desert locations, and kind of getting that desolate feel when they're in the chase and they're being kind of overcome with this sandstorm. To me, coloring in that was ideal to kind of make that moment work, to make it as effective as it is. What I really love, though, is the little details in this book to kind of really to sell the concept. For example, he's reading the book and something is dropped on the book, like an egg is dropped on the book, and then in the next page, when we flash back to the Western story, you see how that actual egg and impacts the art on the page a little bit. The page looks stained, and the lettering itself, how the lettering has a design to kind of look like old text. So it looks like you are reading the book along with him. So in its stylized lettering, I think is dangerous to do, especially when you have this bunch of it, because sometimes it can hinder the reading experience rather than help it. But it just has the right text, the right color choice, so you kind of you understand and get the impact, get the effect of that choice, but at the same time it doesn't make reading any harder. So kudos to the entire art team, and like the writing team as well. I don't know Lonnie Nadler all that well, but I do know Zach Thompson, who I think is one of the most versatile writers in comics right now. Because I'm looking at this book, I look at something like Breathless, I look at something like Lonely Receiver. I think one thing is really certain about the way he approaches comics, he's even written stuff for the big two with Marvel, is that he takes a lot of chances and seems not to settle on one idea or one concept. There's a lot of agility in the way he writes, in the sense of, like, sometimes there are those writers where, like a Bendis, for example, even like a Jeff Lemire, when I'm reading that book and it feels like their story, there's certain elements that reminds me of them. There's a certain artistry, there are tours in that way, where I think Zach Thompson, his voice is not as pronounced, but not necessarily in a bad way, in the sense of like he's able to adjust it for the story that's being told. Like, this is very different than something like I Breathe the Body or Lonely Receiver or other books he's worked on. And to me, that's makes me really excited anytime his name's on a book. It's one that I go to because I feel like I'm going to see something that is taking chances, is trying to do things, and getting creative teams like this that are able to pick up and do those chances successfully, and with the little details that all buy into the idea, they all working together. Of course, it's not just him, and making this idea really worth it. And I do think this is one of the bigger unsung series. The last series was even more underrated than this. I think people even lost it. And like I said, one of the biggest benefits of this series is, even if you've not read the first volume, these are all new characters. This is all new setting. Really, the only thing that's the same is the concept. So you can pick it up and read it and enjoy it, and I would highly advise that you do so. For my number 3, we're going back to Marvel for the Immortal Hulk Time of Monsters #1. And I've been really enjoying these different one-shots they have been doing in the Immortal Hulk universe. Actually, I think almost enjoying them more than the main series. And what's been really good about them is the fact that you can actually read them without reading any of the past Immortal Hulk stories. And when the Immortal Hulk first started, one thing I loved about it was its episodic nature, how you got a complete story with each and every issue. That's kind of changed in the last arcs or so, but this, I think, is bringing back that style in a big way with different writers and different creative teams. This issue is written by Al Ewing and Alex Peckendale, with art by Juan Ferreira. Also, we have a backup story with David Vaughn and Kevin Nolan. What I really liked about this was both issues, the back matter story as well as the main story, were really good. Very different. I don't think they have much in common narratively, but the back matter story was Hulk having this basically fever dream in this movie theater. It looked fantastic. But this doesn't deal with Bruce Banner at all. This is a completely new set of characters dealing with a more ancient times, almost biblical era. Reminds me a lot of the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, how Abraham was told by God to kill his son, and he goes through the motions of potentially doing that, but then God showing him a sign at the very end saying, no, you don't need to do that. He was just testing his faith and going from there. This is basically taking that idea and saying, what if everything he went through it? What if the person that Abraham was someone else that was a little bit more nihilistic in his approach to the people in his tribe? And that's what happens here. An individual is basically sacrificed, and that sacrifice leads him to become this Hulk-like creature. And what starts as kind of a celebration for this town, for this village, turns into something much more brutal, much more violent. And to me, looking at the story, Juan Ferreira's art, oh my goodness, it is great. The art, the coloring is gorgeous. The one word that kind of seeps into my mind when I look at his art is actually cinematic. Like, he has a way of telling stories that really flush out the page. His page designs are always unique. You have this great page spread, for example, where he's able to kind of really follow your eye in interesting ways, and as well as having great inserts and shot design that is very different than your typical comic. He's always doing something new, something original. His character designs are brutal at times. There's a lot of violence in this issue. Definitely, I think a book that would not be approved by the Comics Code if that was still a thing. But that violence also had a level of beauty to it in a way, and I thought the story too kind of got at what people will become in the acts of desperation. You see these individuals, trying to survive because the world has become desolate. There's no food, and because of that, they turn to actions that are immoral to the greatest degree. Even the sense of they may not know the extent of what happened, but kind of buying into this cult-like leader because of what it means for them, and then dealing with those massive repercussions. So again, like a classic fable within the Immortal Hulk universe. It's something that I feel like can breathe a lot of new life into the Immortal Hulk storyline. And we've been getting a lot of these. As I mentioned, we had the one a few months ago by Declan Shelvey, and they've all been very different, all their own little flavors, taking kind of the general concept of Immortal Hulk, but really adjusting it and through different perspectives, through different ideas. Like I said, this is an issue that if you've never read an Immortal Hulk issue, you can understand everything in this and follow it quite well. And hopefully this, to me, gets more people, more eyes on Juan Ferrer art, because I think he's been one of the best Marvel artists in some time. He's done recently like books like Killmonger, which I thought was quite good. And it's a very different style to something like this. Like I mentioned, especially with the coloring, like the page looks aged in a way, like it looks rustic, like you're reading like an ancient document with some of the choices that are made. So, with Immortal Hulk nearing its end, people are wondering, what is the next steps? If this was their next steps, like doing one shots like this, getting different creative teams to kind of still approach this idea, I think Hulk would be in good hands. Again, if this team were to take over the Hulk book, I would be for that as well, because I think it could lead to some great things. For my number 2 this week, I do get one DC book on the list for this week, and it's Nightwing with issue number 80. And the one word that keeps popping up when I'm reading this series, at least since Tom Taylor took it over with this creative team, is delight. This series has been a delight, despite the fact that you have a big storyline in this dealing with the homeless, which is, of course, a serious issue. Generally, the tone has still been delightful. It's been able to, really capture the spirit of why Nightwing is the character that he is. And as mentioned, it's written by Tom Taylor with art by Bruno Redondo and colors by Adriano Lucas and letters by Wes. And I gotta say, this week has been a cavalcade of great creative teams that have really brought their all, from the colorists to the letterers. In the same case with this issue, again, the colors are fantastic here. The art, the creative designs between Bruno Redondo, and I think he really gets this character and the sense of pacing. It's a book that is just a feast for the eyes. It's great to look at with each and every page. His fluidity and his motion from some of the bigger action scenes, the more human moments, like they're all there in each and every issue. And I love some of the side jokes that happen in this too, as Dick lost his wallet to one of the pickpocketers, and you have the rest of the Bat family kind of harping on that, and you have Batgirl in here and their dynamic. There's just a lot of fun here, but some emotional beats as well that are always around the corner. But the emotional beats, I think, lack cynicism. This is an entire book that lacks cynicism. It lacks the dour aspect that you typically get from a Batman book. And I think that is what's really propelled it to the way it is. There's also been a lot of different moving pieces with this. You have some of the Bloodhaven politics in the background, and then you have this character, the Heartless, that's been going around taking people's hearts. Despite the fact that you have multiple pieces, everything still feels very character focused. And that Nightwing and Dick Grayson, the conflict that he has right now has been the driving force. And really the dynamic between him and Batgirl and Barbara Gordon, I think, has been the biggest highlight. Seeing them interact with one another, seeing them happy. Like, I feel like we haven't had a Batman book in, I don't know, forever and a half, where you see characters that have any sense of happiness. And here you get that. And then again, like I mentioned, bad things do happen and they deal with it, but it doesn't send them into this endless spiral of despair or depression. And as a person that has, I think, a limited experience with Nightwing, I've not read a lot of Nightwing comics. I really got into this because of the creative team. It makes me want to go back and check out other Nightwing books to really see what's out there. I've read a little bit of the New 52 run with Kyle Higgins, but generally, to me, this has been a book that I had a lot of anticipation going into it and has never disappointed since. It's been a shining beacon for all of DC, and I'm hoping we get more DC books like this, because I do feel like they have a lot of characters that would fit this mold much more than just Nightwing. My number one this week was actually a pretty easy choice at the end of the day, and sometimes you have those weeks where your number one is hard to choose. Like last week, my number 1, 2, and 3 are really close to one another. That wasn't the case this week. When I read this book, it was actually one of the first books I read. I was like, if another book beats this book, it's going to be one heck of a week. I still think it was a good week, even though nothing beat it. And that's The Many Deaths of Layla Starr, number 2. And this story has been a wonderful read on so many different reasons. This is written by Ram V with art by Felipe Andrade, and it's a story about Death, the character of Death, who's now become mortal. And the only way for her to maybe become immortal again is to kill the individual that's going to cause individuals to become immortal. Unfortunately, she's finding that the act of becoming mortal is having impacts on her that she did not expect. Despite the fact that death has been her game forever, it's not as easy as an act that she thinks it is. And this specifically looks at a very pivotal moment in that individual's life. What really jumps off the page for me in this book is the act of kindness, the emotion behind kindness and love and appreciation for individuals. It's there on each and every page almost. And what this general narrative is looking at is this boy having this relationship with this worker that comes and it kind of helps out his family. And you see that there's a respect there gained. He appreciates this individual and what he does for the family. And he almost looks like a godlike creature in a way. He looks inhuman. He's large, lanky. He looks like an individual that would be amongst the gods himself. But as time goes on, you see that maybe is not the case. And you have this running motif as well of these two figs, basically, that you see these individuals share, and it runs throughout the page. And I love the art in it and how it represents them as like basically this heart. And that is something this book has, is heart. To me, represents the power of life and the importance of death, despite the fact that this is a book that is about the lack of death. But you see why that's important and where mortality can kind of help inform our values and moralities as individuals. I think some people have been comparing this to something like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman universe or something like that. And I can kind of see that comparison, but I feel ultimately that this story is much more human in its design and in its execution. Sometimes I feel like the Gaiman universe is good, but is emotionally cold at times. This, I don't get the feeling. Of course, that's not universal for all the stories, but to me, the human element is the most important part of this story, not the godlike piece. And the art here is always very good. I love how it opens up and you get basically, it's almost like a 12-page grid of Death and this crow kind of having this conversation, very quick pace. But as the story goes on, you get a lot of vertical grids, a lot of wide shots, I think, to represent this world. And you see these funerals and you see the perspective of this child as Death is informing of who he is, like your understanding of why would this individual drive to get people to become immortal. And you're seeing he has this caring emotional center. He's a very empathetic individual, and seeing life through his eyes, like we can share in his empathy. So to me, this was a book on another level this week. It was no question to me that this was my number one book. It's probably one of the best single issues I read this year thus far. Not to heap an unpassed amount of hyperbole on a book. I do try to avoid that, but when it's true, it's true. When I read this book, I was hit in a way I have not been hit by a book in some time. Like I loved other books because of their craftsmanship, like something like Rorschach that I liked last week. That I appreciated on that level. And I did like Carmen last week. It did have an emotional impact on me as well, but this was a bit different, maybe because of the earnestness of it. That's why I liked it, but it was a great read, and one I would advise checking out, with the series only being 2 issues thus far. Something that you can easily pick up and enjoy. And I hope more people do read this book, because I think comics are better when we get books like this. So anyways, those are my picks for this week. I appreciate you taking the time to check out my thoughts. Let me know what your favorite books were in the comment section below. But just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.